Thanks very much, and I'm delighted to be here because I think people in this room are going to fix things, so I really hope that we can contribute to that together. I've been asked in my 12 minutes, but I hear now I can go to 13, so this is good, to address these four issues here. So key models of legal regimes, what's worked and what hasn't, disconnects between the legal regimes, and key opportunities to move forward. And I've been selective. In terms of the key models in Canada, a few things I want to say about this because we've been hearing a lot about there's the workers' compensation. Well, workers' compensation is a no-fault compensation system. And in exchange for reasonably decent levels of benefits, 90% of your net if you're in Quebec, 85% in Ontario, the workers who are injured by the fault of somebody do not have the right to sue if that somebody is an employer in the regime. So people don't always know that, and it's important to know that. Some provinces have motor vehicle no-fault compensation systems as well. And again, we'll get to those in a minute, but when they do, there's actually very good support and very good incentives to help people get back to work. There is support for supplementary costs related to disability. And my last slide, we'll get back to that, or the second to last slide. And Richard Hudon, I think he was the most eloquent speaker on the importance of thinking about who's paying for that prosthesis. And what prosthesis you're going to get depends on what regime you're in. Employment insurance, you get your 15 weeks of EI at 50 to 55% of your salary, depending on circumstances. That's not a great deal of money. CPP and QPP is not a great deal of money either. It's you pay into it and you get maybe, if you're at the maximum, I think about $1,350. I haven't checked recently, I'm sure people will correct me, but you're not getting anything that is a percentage, a high percentage of your pre-injury earnings, unless you were a very low earner at the time. Means-tested support, that's welfareization. And when we talk about means-tested, it's important what we're doing is looking at how much the individual makes, but also how much the family makes. So often, to be eligible, you end up breaking up your family, which these are really very low-income provisions that are provided. And then there's human rights legislation in all our Canadian provinces that ostensibly are supposed to prohibit discrimination. I'll get back to that. Outside of Canada, there are two models that I want to draw to your attention. The Dutch model, which I can't do justice to it in a sentence, but it's universal compensation for people with disabilities regardless of cause, and has been since 1927. I've studied it. There's some very interesting developments in the Netherlands. And the quota system in France and in other European countries is worth looking at. I haven't studied this one. But you, in France, for instance, you have to, as an employer, have 6% of your workforce as with a disability, or you can pay an amount in exchange that goes into a fund that helps to pay for accommodations in those workforces where the employers do want to hire people with disabilities. So I'm just putting that on the table because I think it's worth knowing about. So what's worked to some extent, and now I'm going to stick to Canada, and I'm going to probably have to do this. Well, in terms of the no-fault systems, as I say, they replace the right to sue the person who is responsible for your injury in most cases. And they provide, because of that, significant economic support. And workers' compensation is financed exclusively by employers because they don't have to pay for liability insurance for lawsuits coming from their employees, because that's what workers' compensation is. Systems include economic incentives for the compensation authority and sometimes employers to invest in rehabilitation and labor market reentry. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you're in Quebec and you're earning 90% of your net and you're a maximum, you make before your injury $60,000 or $70,000 a year, if people at the compensation board do not invest in your return to work, you're going to cost the system an awful lot of money. They therefore have this incentive to get you back to work. They have shared that incentive with employers and now have all sorts of different, depending on the province, incentives to employers to bring injured workers back to work. And those incentives are called experience rating, and your premiums as an employer will go up if you decide I'm just not bringing the person back to work. So there are a series of economic incentives in the workers' compensation systems. which exist in all provinces. But the modalities of those change from one province to the next. No-fault automobile insurance, at least in Quebec and Manitoba, it's a pure public system. And the Compensation Board has, again, a huge incentive in trying to bring people back to work. So a lot of the research teams that I knew who were working on disability rights in Quebec were formed by young people who had gone right through their car accident compensation system to a doctorate, because the system really does invest in young people. Otherwise, they're going to have them on their books till the age of 68. So it's a good investment. But if you're not hit in the car accident, then all of a sudden you fall on a much lower level system. So what hasn't worked? In the workers' compensation system, if you're a low-wage earner at the time of your injury, the no-fault systems don't work very well for you. There's little return to work support. There's an evaluation, a cost-benefit evaluation of how much your benefits will cost the system if nothing is done at all. And if nothing is done, if it's not going to cost the system much, not much will be done. I can get into nuances, but not in 12 minutes, so it's going to be like that. I've mentioned the kids in Quebec, where if you're a victim of a car accident at 5, they will presume that you can make the average Canadian earning when you grow up. And that's the level of benefits that you'll receive when you turn 18, and that's the incentive to provide for retraining for these young people. It doesn't exist in the other systems, or most other systems anyway. Lots of workers fall through the cracks in workers' compensation systems, and there are experts in this room, many of whom are the injured workers who either fell through the cracks or know people who did. And in Canada, all the other systems provide inadequate income support. I think we can say that it's very, very difficult to live on the level of benefits that are provided. And what else hasn't worked? Well, experience rating, which I described a minute ago in workers' compensation, has been shown in many, it's supposed to be an economic incentive for employers to retain the workers who are injured in their workplaces. And it works to some extent, and it sometimes works very well. But there's lots of research that's shown that it has also led to screening out of somebody who might cost your business money. If you've got somebody who has a bad back and you're interviewing them, it could be that the existence of experience rating, and there are actually published studies on this, suggests that it would be better if you not hire that person, because down the line they might end up costing your business more money than if you hired somebody who didn't have a bad back. Potentially vulnerable workers, also workers with mental health, that's not experience rated as such, but if you have insurance as an employer, your insurance is going to go up if you have a high level of absenteeism, and sometimes people with mental health issues have variable attendance or might have issues in terms of needing salary insurance. And the problem, because you have this huge economic incentive in workers' compensation to bring workers back to work, and you have a zero economic incentive in some provinces if the employer actually overtly discriminates. And most employers would not overtly discriminate and say so, but I'm a lawyer and a law professor, and I teach lawyers who work for large firms who say, and lovely people, like they're good people, say, I won't let somebody in who has issues because I know down the line it's going to cost me a lot of money. And I happen to have a lawyer from France in the same class who says, oh, we like those people because we have our quota system. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm not saying get the quota system, but I'm saying think about our economic incentives in our legal system right now. What else hasn't worked? The salary insurance is optional. No employer is obliged to provide salary insurance. It exists in the majority of workers, but over 50% of workers have access to this, but it doesn't exist when you're precariously employed. You have a list on the slide of the categories of temporary employment, et cetera, temp agency workers. Often people with disabilities end up being placed by these different precarious employment regimes because they can't get regular jobs. And if the premiums are based, when the employer does provide this, if they're based on the cost of benefits, then that again provides this incentive to screen people out. So the bottom line is that our current system makes a great business case for discrimination, because there's all these incentives to keep the person once you've got them, but there's very little economic incentive to bring the person in. And it depends also on the nature of the disability, and I don't want to overstate the I don't want to overgeneralize, but it's an important issue. So the disconnects between the legal regimes, in terms of workers' comp, you've got your economic drivers of return to work, which are also economic drivers to exclude people with disabilities. You have the right to work, return to work in some provinces and not in others. It's hugely variable across Canada. Sometimes it doesn't exist at all. The precariously employed are not well protected because the business case for fixing them is not really evident when you examine the systems. It's worse in Ontario than in Quebec, because in Quebec they presume you can make minimum wage full time, even if you're only working 10 hours a week. No other province does that, so there really is no business case if that is how you make your decisions. It drives precarious employment, and people with disabilities often end up in precarious employment. In terms of human rights legislation, we've heard it's a complaints-based system. There is no body that is there, like the Workers' Compensation Board, for fight to get you back to work. You have to make the complaint. Unionized workers can use human rights legislation much more effectively than the non-unionized. And in terms of the other supports, it's just not enough money, first of all, and the eligibility requirements are extremely problematic because they can end up breaking up your family. So we have a two-tiered system in technical aids, and Richard Rudon made my case, and it was so eloquent. He said, I have a prosthesis. I'm the oldest injured worker in Ontario. They paid for my prosthesis. I retired, and then they did a cost-benefit analysis on the cost of a new prosthesis, and they said, you're not going to live for more than 4 years. Do we really need to have to buy this? So I don't know if you understood that, but that's the story he told us. And that's my case here. No-fault systems do really well with technical aids, ramps, cars adapted, and all the rest of it. And my belief, and of course I'm not paying for it, so I can just express my belief, is that should be universal. Everybody should have a right to equal access to good support for technical aids. And key opportunities going forward, and this, I believe, is my last slide, except for the pretty picture at the end, provide real incentives to reduce discrimination at time of hiring, and we have to talk about that because we don't have them. Dismantle economic incentives that promote discrimination, and if that means revisiting experience rating, I think that might be a good idea. Review policies to eliminate rules that punish claimants who make attempts to work, and I could go on for a really long time about that, but people don't dare try to get back to work or to volunteer because they're afraid they'll lose their benefits. And finally, the quota system, I've mentioned it. Provide real economic support for people with disabilities that could include public salary insurance regardless of the cause of the disability, as they have in the Netherlands, and it could include universal support for supplementary costs related to disabilities, as I described, so the prosthesis is provided from cradle to grave and not depending on the business case for letting you walk. And I will close on that. Thank you.